This is part 3 of a 5-part video series on local VFR and uncontrolled airfield operations. In this lesson, we leave an East High MOA and execute the VOR 17 at NTA Perry while VFR. Covered in this lesson are VOR approaches, calculating a VDP, DME hold, the DLIDS acronym, standard instrument callouts, and missed approach procedures. After completing MOA work in Area 11 High, the crew will proceed to the Pioneer VOR, and then the instructor will be vectoring the student for the VOR 17 approach at Perry. Much of the information needed for navigating is located on the sectional chart and instrument approach plate. Notice in the approach plate notes box, you need to obtain the Ponca City altimeter setting, unless there happens to be a Unicom controller at Perry that responds to your CTAF radio calls. Unicom stands for Universal Integrated Community. Unicom is a non-government radio communications station that may provide airport information at public use airports where there is no control tower or flight service station. On pilot request, Unicom stations may provide pilots with weather information, wind direction, recommended runway, or other necessary information. As you can see in the VOR 17 profile view, this approach does not have a published visual descent point, partly due to the fact the approach course is not aligned with the runway. In this case, it is a good idea to estimate where the VDP is by dividing the height above touchdown by the glide slope. To calculate your own VDP, divide 546 by 299, and this gives you about 1.8. On this approach, 1.8 miles from the runway is 20.2 miles from the Pioneer VOR. After completing MOA work, obtain the weather information for Perry and do your descent check. The 11248 offers the Doctor Who and NORM acronyms as techniques to help you remember the things that should be accomplished prior to descending from cruise altitude. Ensure weather is VMC at the destination and that you can legally proceed VFR from the MOA to the NTA. For task management purposes, it is recommended to set up the avionics for the approach and brief it while in the MOA. As seen on the RMU, the Pioneer VOR frequency is set in primary, the CTAF frequency is primary on the VHF, and the GPS has been programmed with the FAF, Perry Airport, and Echo for the departure. Once you're done fencing out and ready to leave the MOA, as a technique, position yourself in the MOA for a quick exit away from the MOA. As seen here, the aircraft is near the bottom of the MOA and near the east border. As covered in Part 1, VANS FCIF 19-025 and the T6 standards provide standard phraseology for exiting the MOA to an NTA. To leave the MOA, call up Approach North, Uniform Channel 10, and say your call sign, Request Recovery, NTA Perry. RAPCON will provide initial vectors towards the NTA for traffic and airspace deconfliction. Pilots should cancel IFR no later than 10 nautical miles from the NTA by saying, Texan 13, cancel IFR. Since Perry is approximately 10 miles from Vance's East MOAs, you could also just leave the MOA by saying, Texan 13, cancel IFR, NTA Perry. If there is traffic in the low MOA, expect approach to advise you of the traffic before telling you to squawk VFR and change frequencies. Once VFR and clear of the MOA, proceed direct to the Pioneer VOR or the heading assigned by your instructor. Here the aircraft is also descending to 3,000 feet MSL as assigned by the instructor. Once no longer talking with Vance Approach, Uniform Channel 10, as a technique, set Channel 18 as it's an open frequency. Once on an assigned heading from your instructor, set up your avionics for the approach. Here the aircraft is descending on the downwind vector. Many pilots find DLIDS to be a useful memory aid for setting up for a raw navigate approach. It stands for Display, Localizer or VOR Frequency, Inbound Course, DME Hold, and Speed. The first D in DLIDS is Display. As seen on the HSI, VOR is displayed, which means the VOR frequency is primary in the RMU and the HSI is not in GPS. Put the localizer frequency in primary if shooting a localizer or ILS approach. If flying a VOR approach, input the VOR frequency into the RMU as primary. Put the inbound course in the HSI course select window. The second D in DLIDS is DME hold. On this approach, DME hold is not required because the DME depicted in the profile view is from the Pioneer VOR, which is the frequency also used for lateral navigation. DME hold has a tendency to confuse students at first, so let's spend a minute talking about it. On the left side is the ILS-17 approach at Ponca City, which we looked at in the last video, and on the right is the ILS-17 center at Vance. Is DME hold required on these two approaches? At Ponca City, DME hold is not required. This approach does have DME, but as seen in the profile view, the DME is from IPNC, which is the localizer frequency. At Vance, DME hold is required. As seen in the profile view, the DME is provided by the VOR on frequency 115.4. The localizer frequency, however, must be in primary in the RMU for course and glide slope guidance, and that frequency is 108.9. Okay, last DME hold example. Is DME hold required on the ILS-35 at Woodring? Yes, it is. As seen in the profile view, the DME is off of Woodring VOR, ODG, frequency 109.0. Course and glide slope guidance to fly the approach is based on the localizer frequency of 108.3. Moving on, the S in D lids is speed. Per the T6 standards, on radar downwind, fly 200 knots indicated. Set the torque for desired descent rate and pitch for 200. If you find yourself with nothing to do on downwind, knock out an ops check and consider putting something useful into the GPS. Here, the GPS has the final approach fix of CASUP and inbound course of 189 OBS. This GPS display is telling you lots of good information. For starters, you can visually see you are southwest of the airfield and west of the inbound course. From the top DME, you see you are 11.0 miles from the final approach fix. You are also 4.3 miles left of course, as seen in the DME third line from the bottom. From the bottom number, you can also see your track over the ground is 018 degrees, which we'll talk more about in a minute once we're on final. After several minutes flying north on the downwind leg of the approach, the instructor will give you a base leg heading as seen here. Notice that the aircraft is level at 3,000 feet with 40% torque set and 180 knots. As seen in the GPS, the aircraft is also 4.4 miles from the inbound course. Typically, the dogleg heading and approach clearance will occur 2 to 3 miles from the inbound course. That turn and clearance for this approach will sound something like Texan 13, 12 miles from final approach fix, turn right heading 140, maintain 3,000 feet until established on course, cleared VOR 17 approach, Perry. Per the T6 operating standards and 11217, you only have to read back headings, altitudes, altimeter settings, and clearances. So your readback should sound something like Texan 13, 140, 3,000 feet, cleared VOR 17 approach. Normally, you will be vectored to intercept final at a distance of about 3 to 5 miles from the final approach fix, but this can vary quite a bit based on weather, traffic sequencing, and controller preference. To prevent overshooting final, begin the turn immediately after you hear the heading and, as a technique, bug that heading to help remember it. Here we see the aircraft is on the 140 intercept heading for the approach. Notice 30% torque is set, which slowed the aircraft to approximately 160 knots. As soon as the CDI needle moves off of the wall, turn to the final approach heading at a speed commensurate with the CDI needle movement rate. Per the 11217, you are considered established on course for a VOR once within 1 dot on the HSI. Once within 1 dot, you may descend to no lower than 2,900 feet for this approach until past the final approach fix. As a reminder, that line under the 2,900 means do not be lower than 2,900 feet, but you can be higher. Once on final, make a radio call on Perry's CTAF 122.8, announcing your intentions to any other aircraft that may be at Perry. An example radio call for this situation is Perry traffic, T6 Texan 2, 14 miles north of the airfield, 3,000 feet, VOR 17 straight in, Perry. Make another radio call 5 miles from the runway. The 11248 and -1 offer different techniques for where to configure. So in summary, configure somewhere between the FAF and 5 miles prior. According to the before landing checklist, the gear should be down no later than the final approach fix. Notice in this example, the gear is down and flaps are takeoff, 2.4 miles from the final approach fix, and torque is in the low 30s to keep the aircraft above 120 knots. Per the Dash 1, the approach should be flown at 110 knots, which for a non-precision descent rate is approximately 16% torque and 1 degree nose low. After departing minimums, slow to final approach speed. Maintaining course and not S-turning down final is a critical piece of flying a good approach. On final, use the GPS SuperNav 5 page to assist you in your course maintenance. The bottom number is your actual track. To prevent winds aloft from blowing you off course, turn to the HSI heading that makes your GPS track number match your final approach course. Here, the aircraft has reached the minimum decision altitude of 1540. The grading standard is plus 100 feet and minus 0, so as a technique, it is best to aim for 50 feet above MDA. The T6 operating standards direct the student and instructor to say certain things once past the final approach fix. The callouts vary slightly depending on the approach type and desired training objectives. On a non-precision approach, the student must level off at the MDA prior to reaching the VDP and say MDA and VDP once arriving at that altitude and DME. Once VDP is announced by the student, the instructor will say runway in sight if the instructor desires to grade a transition to landing. If the instructor wishes to see a missed approach for grading purposes, they will say runway not in sight after the student says VDP. Do not descend below MDA unless you hear runway in sight from the instructor. Likewise, during an ILS approach, the student must say DA upon reaching the decision altitude. Regardless of what the instructor says at DA, the aircraft will descend slightly below decision altitude during this brief communication process, which is both normal and intentional. If told runway not in sight, the student is expected to maintain the MDA to the missed approach point and say MAP, and then execute the missed approach procedure using max power 10 to 15 degrees pitch. Deconfigure the aircraft, confirm the aircraft is clean configuration, then adjust pitch and power as desired and execute the missed approach procedure. This is what you should see at the VDP. Notice the approach course is not aligned with the runway, so when told runway in sight, you will have to jink to the right to align with the runway. At a mile from the runway, you should be approximately 300 feet above the ground and just about lined up on final. If you haven't done so recently, make a radio call over CTAF. Once complete with pattern or approach work at Perry, depart as discussed in part 2 of this series.